One of the things that I was puzzled a bit by in your chapter, I'll draw you out on it, is that unlike a lot of people, you're rather pleased with the High Court decision over corporations' power.
Yes, I don't think that's a common view.
It's not a common view. And to explain a little bit more, that you think it does provide the opportunity for a more or less full Commonwealth takeover. It's, they largely do run the show now anyhow.
Yes.
But I'm not really wanting to push you on that so much, as you seem to think that a full Commonwealth takeover will lead or can lead to greater diversity. And so, I mean, it's a paradox. I don't think it's a contradiction, but it's a paradox that I think needs to be explained. Because at the moment, I agree with your diagnosis, and have for a long time, that there is a terrible uniformity amongst the universities, at least, or those things called universities since Dawkins. So why should complete Commonwealth control made possible by the High Court lead to something we both would like, greater diversity in the sector?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it goes to the heart of a lot of the strategic issues at the moment. My feeling about the corporations' power decision, and I wonder if that's going to be revisited now we've got a change of government, because my reading of that really is that was a political decision to support the government of the day in a key area. That,
I don't think the judges would agree. That way of putting it.
But in fact, they did fall in line, and with the work choices legislation in a way which was almost too well crafted to be explained any other way. I have mixed feelings. I've got concerns about, more than mixed feelings, about universities being defined as corporations, because I think that they're somewhat different to that, and they really need their own category. While they might engage in trading activity, and they do, as we know, in a number of areas, to say that that defines their identity is another matter, and yet that's I think you have to read the judgment. That's what it's saying. However, be that as it may, we are now in as is the manner of High Court decisions, we're now in the situation that it creates, and it can then go in a number of different directions. The reason why I think we're better off operating in the sector on the basis of a single government is that what we have now is a strange mixed governmental regulatory framework whereby the Commonwealth has the whip hand because it has the financial power, and it drives its control of the sector through the financial, through the economic frame. The states have a broad-based, overarching, supervisory, pastoral role in relation to the universities, as they do in relation to schools and TAFE, where they've got a wider set of objectives than just economic objectives, and a wider set of mechanisms than just economic ones. They're concerned about issues like social equity, for example, in the way their legislation is framed. But the states are ineffective in exercising this larger policy responsibility. So what's happened is that the Commonwealth, which for a period of time in the 60s and 70s had a broad overarching kind of national interest approach to the universities and was prepared to put a lot of things into that framework, over time gradually narrowed its emphasis to purely economic objectives and to tying universities, especially after Dawkins, to economic policy, and left in the hands of the states the larger set of public interest issues, larger set of values, including cultural and social values, which were thereupon rendered ineffective because the states had no power. What I'd like to see is a situation where the Commonwealth was exercising a broad superintendentary role, where it had obligations to take into account not only the role of universities in relation to economic objectives, but their social character and role, their cultural character and role, their contribution to foreign relations, which seem to me as important as the raw dollars that the export industry takes in, for example. And recognising that broader set of objectives, I think we'd have a better policy discussion about the universities, a much more enabling one. So I suppose it's with the hope that a broader framework could turn into a larger policy conversation that I pursued it. But having said that, I know that it doesn't necessarily have to happen in the best possible way. It can also happen in such a way that the Commonwealth uses a larger power to achieve an equally narrow set of objectives as the Commonwealth has done in the recent past. So, but at least I think by having an unambiguous Commonwealth role here, we would have the opportunity to develop a better frame. As for diversity, well, I think the reason why the sector is so similar, and you've got a situation where everyone's trying to imitate a common role, which is that of the research-intensive university with a lot of international students, even if there may be not a lot of research activity, everyone's still purporting to adopt that role. and mostly not doing it as well as they should or could. The reason we have that is because we have a common set of financial drivers which have a particularly narrowing effect. Again, if we had a larger set of policy objectives like regional development, for example, was part of the mix, then institutions' broader missions could start to become apparent and start to play a role in their Commonwealth policy making. But having said that, well, I'm not yet convinced that would necessarily move that way.
It has to become a conscious
objective
of a large number of people that it is better to have a diverse sector.
I think so. There are good signs, though, that the great government's onto this early. The policy that Labor has in this area is called compacts, and compacts are a sort of rewording of the national contract, I think, in a looser way, which are about the individual university agreeing on its mission with the government and the government funding
on
it
a one-to-one thing between a particular university and the government.
That's right. Now, you want that to be transparent because otherwise it becomes a basis for special deal making and perhaps inequities get created and so on. But if it is transparent, then you've got potentially the evolution of a division of labour, so that you have research-intensive universities, you have universities that educate large numbers of international students if that's what they want to do, you have institutions with local missions, with regional missions and so on, you have institutions which specialise in particular kinds of students perhaps.
Yes. I mean, I suppose this leads very naturally to the next question. I've got three very big sort of general questions I want to ask, which are a little bit outside what's in the chapter. And the first one comes exactly from what you've just said. I mean, one reading of the drift of things in the university sector is that resources will be directed mainly to the group of 8.
Yes. And
that the other 30 or so universities, many of which I think have strengths, I have a bias in this because I belong to one of those 30 and have very patriotically for a long time, that the other universities will tend to become second-class institutions. Do you think that's likely, and do you think it would be a good or bad thing?
Well, it would be a bad thing. It would be a bad thing to reduce the capacity that currently exists and to stop it developing further. I mean, it's always a bad thing, I think. Makes no sense at all. If you take the capacity building argument seriously, and building national capacity and education research is, I think, what we're mostly talking about, then it must apply to all institutions, and it must apply to making schools better, it must apply to making TAFE institutions much sharper and better than they are now. It's certainly all universities. And you would not see any university that currently is seriously committed to and engaged in research no longer doing research, or any part of a university for that matter. That makes no sense at all. My own feeling is that, and I've had some interesting discussions with a number of people around these themes in the last few weeks, and there's a surprising level of agreement on this, is that if we build Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland, Western Australia perhaps, as research specialist institutions on top of what they currently do, in the manner that ANU is already in that category, then we will not subtract resources from the rest of the system unless that's the game that the government decides to play, that it makes it a zero-sum game. I don't think the government will. It wouldn't be good electoral politics for a start to create a lot of enemies in the university sector. And I think the government would also want to build capacity too. I would hope so. But I would think on the whole, the politics are such that if there's a serious national commitment to investing more in the research capacity of the leading universities, that will build the argument for investment in knowledge overall, that will legitimate the other institutions as well. I think we're in a favourable environment where we can play it as a positive sum game, not a zero-sum game.
And diversity is not a euphemism for the favouring of
the already it's not just powerful. Vertical diversity. I mean, it's quite important to avoid that. Particularly, I would mention the category of universities which were also established as research universities after Monash, which was the last of the G of 8. And I mean, the universities like Macquarie, La Trobe, Flinders, Griffith and Murdoch and so on. And those universities have done remarkable things with sparse resources over a long period of time. They've sustained intellectual cultures and often been the most innovative in their fields. I mean, I work out at La Trobe in relation to Thesis 11, which I think is an outstanding group. I mean, intellectually a very strong group. Griffith is a place where I've also drawn a great deal of intellectual sustenance over the years, and continues to sustain some very good people in the humanities and social sciences. And and often it was those institutions that pioneered the orientation to Asia, along with Monash and New South Wales, to the last of the G of 8 really, and ANU. perhaps, those institutions were ahead of the play in relation to Asia for many years. And you'd expect that those traditions, recent as they are, if you like, in the long life of the university as an institution, can turn over and continue. But what we've never done since the Dawkins changes is really develop the potential of the new universities properly. Because when they were first called universities by Dawkins, and after Dawkins, they were never funded for basic research. They were allowed to compete for research grants, but they were never funded within their operating grant, within their teaching and research positions grant, for the research capacity in the way that the pre-1987 universities were. And one of the problems, of course, was that then the government took money away from the pre-1987s to equalise matters by levelling downwards.
Now, I've got two large questions to finish with. The first is this, that in a way the spirit of our discussion, and I think it's in tune with what's happening in the real world, is that there's globalisation and economy is the driving force for both the growth of the sector and also its kind of reason. That the contemporary economy and the globalised world needs a research-rich university sector. One of the, I'm an old-fashioned person in many ways. One of the things I worry about, given that this is sort of true, and I accept that it's true, is that a more traditional part of the conception of the university, which places economy a very long way away, and which says that what universities are about is not even really research so much as the cultivation of citizenship and the growth of a kind of civilised community, and which places pure sciences and humanities at the very centre of the conception of the university. And in a way, it seems to me very hard to hang on to that conception, given the real language and the real forces that are working in the contemporary economy. Can I just ask for your response to that problem?
Well, where I'd unpick that would be to start at the very beginning and say globalisation is not primarily an economic process. It is as much an economic process as a cultural process and vice versa. And I find the two totally intertwined at every level. I mean, I can't give priority to one over the other. It seems to me that the communicative cultural environment created by IT, but also by a common language, global language English, all those aspects of globalisation provide conditions for worldwide markets. Worldwide markets undoubtedly impel convergence in a cultural sense, and we see that in the university sector as much as anywhere else. But the communicative aspect should not be underplayed, and this has all coincided with the knowledge economy and its emergence. So globalisation and knowledge economy, while I wouldn't say they're akin exactly, they're distinguishable, describable processes, nevertheless are intertwined too. And globalisation has foregrounded research capacity in cultural matters on a world scale. And a lot of research capacity comes back to basic inquiry and basic knowledge. And much of what is being sent around the world in the new industries that have emerged, like the creative industries and so on, is knowledge-rich goods and culturally rich goods. And again, when you say culture as well as knowledge, you shift away from it just being about science to being about social sciences and humanities. I find all these cards are on the table at once in the way the university sector and globalisation are developing. So I'm not, I guess, pessimistic about globalisation in the sense of it driving too narrow a framework of human existence or conversation or cultural life. I think that in a lot of ways it's brought a lot of more cultural artefacts forward, and a lot of cultural exchange has come onto the agenda that wasn't previously possible, and the universities are central. So I think you might say that the question of whether it's too economised or too narrowly so, whether the universities become too instrumental in their function or don't, is an open question, and it's always being fought out. But the potential is there for the universities to become enabling and broadening culturally and socially, as well as economically driving prosperity, as presumably in some respects they certainly do. So I don't think we need...
So you're not pessimistic about that?
I'm not pessimistic about the economisation of the universities, which was, I think, a core issue that arose out of the neoliberal era, the kind of Thatcher version of neoliberal policy, the new public management in universities, still playing out very much so, that kind of too narrow a conception of what we do. I think that's continuing danger. but that's not being driven by globalisation per se. I mean, globalisation can take that form in the higher education sector if we want it to, but it doesn't have to, and there's nothing natural about the process that forces it down that road. I mean, I agree with your broad conception. I think universities are about person formation, and they're about social relations and cultural relations and the formation of those as much as they're about anything else. I suspect that we're going to see the core disciplines survive this period. They will be contested and there will be issues on their margins as ever. There will be also issues about so-called solos versus interdisciplinarity and so on. All those things will play out. The larger issue I think that we have to contend with in Australia is whether the core disciplines remain broadly available to the population or whether they become centred in a small number of elite institutions. We're already seeing a situation where out of the last 20 years of university policy, a lot of core disciplines, I mean, including philosophy, are centred in a minority of institutions. Yeah. And that seems to me to be quite concerning with increasing number of students studying generic, vaguely vocational areas like business where they can do good work. I mean, you can have a rigorous business course, but they're not necessarily obliged to do good work just by the existence of that curriculum.
Yes.
And I think we'll have to
there might be a retreat of the more traditional or core disciplines into a smaller number of institutions.
I think that's happened already, and it'll be more a question now of how do we bring them back to interpenetrate the larger curriculum. For instance, if I was building a business studies curriculum myself, I'd try to get a number of core social sciences and humanities disciplines in there. Obviously psychology, but possibly areas such as English and cultural studies. You'd like to see philosophy in any university course. You'd certainly like to see history and policy studies and political science in a management training program. And there's, I mean, as it is now, the only social science of substance that business programs are obliged to take in, and they're not all obliged to take even that in, is economics. Yes. And economics can be quite narrowly defined, of course, and become quite technical.
Yes. And final question, which is related, I don't know whether you're at all sympathetic to this, but it seems to me that we should distinguish in language between universities and higher education.
Yeah.
I think, that both concepts matter, but I think insofar as, and I've noticed in all sorts of discussions, the terms are used interchangeably. Yes. I think that if that happens, then what was once seen as kind of distinct about universities is under threat, because it seems to me I'm not against many higher education institutions doing different things. I take that to be part of diversity. But I do think one of the parts of the sector ought to be university, and that ought to have a distinctive character, which is more to do with the pursuit of truth, and research is a modern way of putting that, but more to do with the pursuit of truth and the cultivation of citizenship. And so I just wondered if you're at all sympathetic to this semantic question.
I think you're quite right. I mean, I think it's important to have that organising distinction at our fingertips. And what's tended to happen is that there's been a tendency to pursue a sort of status politic rather than a social division of labour here, and we've moved away from the idea of a social division of labour which is presumably flexible and where the different areas should articulate, to the idea that it's all equally valid, it's all higher education, which conceals a whole lot of inequalities underneath. But for a variety of reasons, governments have found that the easiest road to travel on, and it's suited the institutions that have had upward aspirations. So even if they don't get the money to become research intensive, at least they get the apparent reputation. Yeah. So I'm quite comfortable about the idea that we talk about, either we talk about some institutions as universities and others as something else, and I'd include TAFE in my definition of higher education, especially if it's better funded, as the Americans do with community colleges. Or we talk about a category distinction between research universities and others. Now, in the immediate context, that's likely to prove more difficult, I suspect, than the former course, which is to locate the name university around a conception of a knowledge-intensive, discipline-based, intellectually formative mission. I think I'd be inclined, probably the only slight difference with the way you've summarised it, is that I'd be inclined to say that citizenship is a larger conception that perhaps belongs everywhere in education, that they've all got some kind of role in, certainly in socialisation. So once you say socialisation, I think you'd want that to include citizenship, although their role might be more centred in universities, it might be more explicit and more complex, and perhaps more time will be put into it. Yes.
Great. Anyhow, thank you very much.
Oh, pleasure.